Damian Moretti thought he had lost everything 10 years ago when Elena Cross disappeared without a word. Tonight, stepping into a shabby late-night diner to escape his incessant insomnia, he unexpectedly sees her behind the counter, older, more tired, but still with those same eyes. Then an 8-year-old girl rushes to hug her, freezes at the sight of him, and whispers a word that shatters the Mafia boss's world. "Daddy?" All the lies he'd believed for a decade crumble in an instant. Follow the story to the end, and don't forget to like and leave a comment letting me know which city you're watching from. Rain hit the windshield like static, and Damian Moretti sat behind the wheel of a car he didn't remember parking, watching a diner sign flicker red through the wet glass. Moretti's? No. Ellie's Diner. The letters buzzed, half dead, the apostrophe burned out years ago. He hadn't meant to stop here. He'd meant to keep driving until the city blurred into nothing and the noise in his skull finally shut up. But his hands had turned the wheel without asking permission, and now he was just sitting there, engine ticking as it cooled, watching steam rise off a parking lot that smelled like asphalt and old rain. He hadn't slept in 4 nights. Not real sleep, the kind where you close your eyes and your brain keeps replaying every man you've put in the ground, every promise you broke to keep the empire standing. 3 hours ago, he'd watched Sal Bianchi beg on his knees in a warehouse in Red Hook, watched his own men look away while Damian decided whether the man lived or died for skimming 40 grand off a shipment. He let him live. He didn't know why. He used to never hesitate. That was the kind of night this was, the kind where a man starts wondering what he traded to get here. He pushed open the car door and the cold hit him like an open hand. 41 years old, and he still walked like there was a target on his back. Shoulders squared, eyes already mapping exits before his feet hit the pavement. The door, the kitchen passed through, the fire exit with the bent hinge. Old habits, the kind that kept his father alive for 2 decades before they didn't. The bell over the diner door gave a tired jingle. Inside it smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, fluorescent light buzzing overhead. A jukebox in the corner playing something low and scratched that nobody was listening to. Empty booths. A trucker asleep in the corner with his hat over his face. And behind the counter, Damian stopped walking. She had her back to him, pouring coffee into a thermos with the kind of tired precision that comes from doing the same motion 10,000 times. Dark hair pulled back, a few strands stuck to her neck with sweat, even though the place was cold. A waitress uniform 2 sizes too big, like she'd lost weight she didn't have to lose. He knew that posture. He knew the way her shoulders sat low and tight, like she was always bracing for something to fall on her. 10 years. 10 years and his body still recognized her before his mind caught up. "Sit anywhere, hun. Menus are—" She turned around with the coffee pot in her hand, words dying somewhere in her throat. Elena Cross looked at him the way you look at a car wreck you're standing too close to. Her hand didn't shake. That was the thing he noticed first. Her hand didn't shake, but the coffee pot tilted just enough that a thin stream of black coffee ran over the rim and onto the floor, and neither of them moved to stop it. Elena. Her name came out of him rougher than he wanted. 10 years of practiced control, and it still cracked on one syllable. "You need to leave." Her voice was flat, not scared. Worse than scared, done. Like she'd rehearsed this exact moment in her head 100 times and decided exactly how she'd play it, and the answer was always the same. "Right now, Damian. You work here." He said it like an accusation, like the fact of her, alive, breathing, pouring coffee in some forgotten diner on the edge of his territory, was a personal insult. 10 years, and you're pouring coffee in a diner 2 miles from my house. 3 miles. Her jaw tightened. I checked. I made sure it was 3. That landed somewhere under his ribs and stayed there. "Elena, don't." She set the pot down hard enough that the trucker in the corner stirred under his hat. "Don't you dare stand in my restaurant and say my name like you have any right to it." He could have walked out. Every instinct that had kept him alive through 3 assassination attempts and a war with the Calloway family told him to walk out, get in the car, drive until this feeling burned itself out the way everything else eventually did. But his feet stayed planted on the cracked linoleum, and he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He asked instead of demanded. "Why'd you leave?" Something moved behind her eyes. pain, maybe, or just exhaustion too deep to fake anything else. You know why? I know what I was told. Same thing. Her voice shook now, finally, the first crack in 10 years of armor. You chose the family business over me, Damien. You chose the guns and the money and your father's ghost over... The bell over the door rang again. A small body crashed through it like a comet, breathless, soaked from the rain, sneakers slapping wet against the floor. Mom, the Hendersons' dog got loose again, and Mrs. Patterson chased it into the... The girl stopped dead 3 feet from the counter. She was small for 8, all elbows and knees, dark curls plastered to her forehead from the rain, a backpack slung over one shoulder with a cracked dinosaur keychain hanging off the zipper. She looked at Elena first, the automatic glance kids give their mothers when something's wrong in a room. Then she looked at Damien, and she stopped breathing. Damien had stared down men holding guns to his head without blinking. He had walked into rooms where every person present wanted him dead and felt nothing but the cold calculation of survival. But the way this child looked at him, like she was doing math, like she was matching his face against something stored carefully in her memory, made something in his chest seize up like a fist closing around his heart. She reached into the front pocket of her backpack with shaking fingers and pulled out a photograph, creased soft at the corners from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. The kind of wear that only comes from years of handling. She looked down at it, looked up at him. Down. Up. Lily. Elena's voice cracked clean in half. Lily, baby, go to the back. That's you. The girl's voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the entire diner like a gunshot. She held the photograph up, hand trembling. This is you in Mom's picture. Damien's whole world tilted sideways. He looked at the photo without meaning to, without being able to stop himself. It was him, younger, 28 maybe, before the lines carved themselves into his face, before his eyes learned to go cold on command. He had his arm around Elena on some beach he couldn't place, both of them laughing at something the camera never caught. He remembered that day in fragments, sunburn, cheap beer, Elena's laugh carrying over the waves. Lily. Elena came around the counter fast, dropping to her knees in front of the girl, hands on her shoulders, physically trying to turn her away from him. Sweetheart, go to the back room, please. Just for a minute. Is he my dad? The diner went silent except for the jukebox scratching through its song and the rain hammering the windows. Elena's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Damien stared at the girl, at Lily, and felt the floor of his entire existence crack open beneath him. The eyes. He'd been too caught up in Elena to see it before, but the eyes were his. His mother's eyes, actually, passed down through him like a curse he didn't know he'd given away. The stubborn set of the jaw, the way she stood with her weight on her back foot, ready to either run or fight, exactly the way he'd stood since he was old enough to know the world wanted to hurt him. Lily, please. Elena's voice broke completely now, tears running silent down her face. Not like this. Not here. But Lily wasn't looking at her mother anymore. She was looking at Damien with an intensity that belonged to someone 3 times her age, an intensity born from years of looking at a photograph and wondering, and now the wondering was standing 6 feet away from her in a wet leather jacket with rain still dripping off his hair. Are you? She asked again, smaller this time, like the bravado that got the question out the first time had burned itself up entirely. Damien's throat closed. He'd negotiated with killers. He'd stood over his own father's body and given orders before the blood was even cold, because that's what the family needed. That's what survival demanded. He had never, not once in his adult life, not known what to say. I don't... His voice came out wrong, too rough, and he hated himself for it. He crouched down slowly, the way you'd approach something wild and easily spooked, bringing himself level with her instead of looming over her like every instinct screamed at him to stay standing, stay in control. What's your birthday, kid? Elena made a sound like she'd been struck. Lily blinked, thrown by the question. March 14th. The math did itself in his skull before he could stop it, fast and brutal and undeniable. 9 months back from March. 9 months back put him in a cheap motel room with Elena 3 days before his father's funeral. The two of them clinging to each other like the world was ending, because for both of them, in different ways, it was. 8 years old, he said, and it wasn't a question. Lily nodded, eyes huge. He looked up at Elena, kneeling on the floor of her own diner, mascara running, hands clenched into the fabric of her apron, like she was trying to physically hold herself together. 10 years of believing she'd abandoned him because she couldn't stomach what he'd become. 10 years of telling himself that story so many times it had calcified into truth. You had my daughter. His voice came out hollow, stripped of every defense he'd built since he was 18 years old and inherited a war he never asked for. You had my daughter, and you let me believe. I let you believe what I was told to believe. Elena's whisper was vicious, raw, 10 years of grief finally finding an exit. Same as you. What does that mean? Before she could answer, the bell over the door rang a third time, and this time it wasn't Rain that walked in. Two men in dark coats, the kind of stillness in their posture that Damien recognized instantly, because he'd trained men to move exactly that way. His men. Marcus and Tony, his closest security, faces tight with the particular urgency that only came when something had gone seriously wrong. Boss? Marcus's eyes flicked to Elena, to Lily, cataloging the scene with the speed of a man who'd been doing this job for 15 years. Whatever he saw, he filed it away without a flicker of expression crossing his face. We need you outside, now. Not now. Damien didn't look away from Elena. Boss? Tony's voice had an edge to it that made Damien's spine go rigid, the specific tone reserved for things that couldn't wait, that wouldn't wait, that meant blood somewhere if they did wait. It's Salazar. He's called an emergency meeting of the capos. Tonight. He says it's about a security breach in the organization. Damien's jaw tightened. Victor Salazar didn't call emergency meetings. Victor Salazar was the man who'd stood beside Damien's father for 20 years, who'd been the one to find Damien in a hospital corridor the night his father was shot and tell him, voice steady as stone, that the Empire needed him now, that grief was a luxury for men who didn't have families depending on them. Victor was the closest thing to a mentor Damien had left in the world, the man who'd whispered in his ear 10 years ago that Elena had run because she couldn't live with what Damien was becoming, the same man standing behind every piece of advice that had shaped the last decade of Damien's life. Tell him I'm coming. Damien's eyes didn't leave Elena's face. Give me 5 minutes. Marcus and Tony exchanged a look, but retreated to the door, giving him the distance, though Damien knew they wouldn't go far. Not tonight. Not with whatever Salazar had stirred up. Damien turned back to Lily, who hadn't moved, who was still staring up at him like he might disappear if she blinked. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He didn't know what to do with any of it. The years, the lies, the small, terrified, hopeful face in front of him that shared his blood and his stubborn jaw, and apparently nothing else about the life he'd lived. I have to go, he said, and the words tasted like ash. But I'm coming back, tonight, tomorrow. I don't know when, but I'm coming back. People always say that. Lily's voice was quiet, flat in a way that broke something in him completely, the particular flatness of a child who'd already learned not to trust promises. Mom says that's what dads do. They say they're coming back. Elena flinched like she'd been slapped. Damien stood up slowly, body aching in places that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, the exhaustion carved into her face, the fear that lived behind her eyes now where there used to be only warmth, and felt 10 years of carefully constructed certainty collapse into something he didn't have a name for yet. Not quite rage, not quite grief. Something underneath both of those, older and more dangerous. Salazar told me you left because you couldn't live with what I'd become, he said quietly. Was that a lie too? Elena's eyes flicked toward the door, toward Marcus and Tony waiting in the rain, and something tightened in her face. Fear, real fear, the kind that lived in a person's bones. You need to go, she said again, but this time it wasn't an order. It was a plea. Please, Damien. Before he finds out you were here. Before who finds out? She didn't answer. She pulled Lily against her side, protective, final, the the conversation closing like a door slamming shut. Damien stood in the doorway of a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and 10 years of buried lies, looking at a daughter he didn't know existed an hour ago, and a woman he'd spent a decade hating for a betrayal that was starting to look like something else entirely. The rain hadn't let up outside. If anything, it had gotten worse, hammering the windows like something trying to get in. "This isn't over," he said. "It never started," Elena whispered back, but her voice didn't sound like she believed it anymore. He walked out into the storm, past Marcus and Tony, into a car that suddenly felt too small to hold everything he was carrying. Behind him, through the rain-streaked window, he could see Elena pull Lily into her arms, both of them shaking. And for the first time in 10 years, Damien Moretti understood that the war he thought he'd already fought and survived hadn't even started yet. Whatever Victor Salazar was about to tell him at that emergency meeting, Damien already knew one thing with a certainty that settled cold and final in his chest. Somebody had spent a decade lying to him, and that same somebody was standing right outside that diner door, waiting to find out exactly how much he'd already learned. The warehouse on 10th Street had been his father's favorite place to hold court, and Victor Salazar had kept the tradition alive out of what Damien always assumed was respect. Now walking through the rain toward the loading dock doors, water running down the back of his collar, Damien wondered if it had ever been respect at all, or just a man marking territory he intended to keep. Marcus drove. Tony rode shotgun, jaw working like he was chewing on something he didn't want to say. Damien sat in the back, soaked, replaying Lily's face over and over until it blurred together with the photograph she'd pulled from her backpack, until he couldn't tell anymore which image was the memory and which was the wound. "You gonna tell me what happened back there?" Marcus asked, eyes flicking to the rear view. "No." "Boss, I said no, Marcus." The car went quiet except for the wipers dragging across the windshield, that rhythmic squeal that usually didn't bother him, and tonight felt like something scraping directly against his skull. He pressed 2 fingers against his eyes and tried to slow his breathing down, the way his father taught him before sit-downs that mattered, before negotiations where one wrong flinch could cost you a finger or a life. Breathe slow. Let them think you're already 3 moves ahead. Never let them see you bleed. He'd been bleeding for 10 years and never known it. The warehouse doors were already open when they pulled up, yellow light spilling out into the wet dark, and Damien counted the cars in the lot out of pure habit. 6 capos, plus Salazar's personal vehicle, plus 2 unmarked sedans he didn't recognize, which made his stomach tighten before he'd even stepped out of the car. Inside, the air smelled like motor oil and cigarette smoke. 15 men standing in a loose circle around a folding table with nothing on it but a single manila folder. Victor Salazar stood at the head of it, 61 years old, silver hair combed back the same way it had been combed back for 30 years, wearing the kind of calm that Damien used to mistake for wisdom, and was starting, in the last hour, to recognize as something closer to control. "Damien," Victor's voice carried across the warehouse, warm on the surface, something colder underneath it that Damien had simply never had the eyes to see before tonight. "You're soaked. Sit." "I'll stand." A flicker crossed Victor's face, there and gone, but Damien caught it, the way you catch a blade glinting in low light. "Suit yourself." The capo shifted, sensing something off in the air, the way men who'd survived decades in this life always could. Salbianchi stood near the back, the bruise on his jaw from 3 hours ago already purpling, eyes downcast, a man grateful to be breathing and trying not to remind anyone he was in the room. Damien's cousin Nico leaned against a support beam, arms crossed, watching Damien with the kind of careful blankness family wore when they smelled blood in the water, and didn't know yet whose blood it would be. "You said there was a security breach." Damien's voice came out flatter than he intended, exhaustion bleeding through the edges of his control. "There is." Victor opened the folder, slid it across the table without looking at it, like he already had every word memorized. "Federal surveillance. 2 agents made contact with one of our shipping coordinators last week. Offered him immunity for information on the Castellano route." Damien picked up the folder. Photographs. Grainy, telephoto. A man he recognized as Dominic Reyes meeting 2 men in plain sedans outside a coffee shop in Queens. The kind of photographs that, 6 months ago, would have sent him straight into the cold, mechanical calculus of damage control. Find Reyes. Find out what he gave them. Handle it. Tonight, all he could think about was a little girl's voice asking if he was her father. "Where's Reyes now?" Damien asked. "Gone." Victor's mouth tightened. "Disappeared 2 days ago. Either he ran, or somebody got to him before we could ask questions." "You think it's the feds?" "I think," Victor said slowly, each word weighted like he was laying stones across a path, "that we have had a leak in this organization for years. Not days. Years. And I think it's time we discussed why." The room went still in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "What's that supposed to mean?" Damien's hand tightened on the folder. Victor looked at him then, and for the first time in 10 years, Damien saw something in the old man's eyes that he couldn't immediately name, something that made the hair on his arms stand up even before Victor spoke again. Calculation. Patience worn thin. The look of a man approaching the end of a very long game. "It means," Victor said, "that I think someone close to this family has been talking to outside parties for a long time. Long enough to explain things that never made sense. The Callaway ambush in '09. The warrant that almost caught your father at the Brooklyn house. I've had my suspicions for years, Damien, and tonight, with the feds circling Reyes, I think it's time we I want to talk about Elena." The words came out of Damien's mouth before he'd decided to say them, cutting clean through whatever speech Victor had rehearsed, and the warehouse went so quiet that Damien could hear the rain hitting the metal roof, could hear Sal Bianchi's breath catch somewhere behind him. Victor's face didn't move. That was the first lie Damien caught. A real man, an innocent man, would have looked confused, would have asked what one thing had to do with the other. Victor's face simply went still, the practiced stillness of someone recalculating in real time. "Elena Cross," Damien said again, louder, watching every micro shift in Victor's expression like his life depended on it, because some animal part of his brain had already decided that it did. "I saw her tonight. I saw my daughter." A murmur went through the capos. Nico straightened off the support beam. Even Sal Bianchi lifted his head, forgetting his own recent disgrace in the face of something far more interesting. "Daughter," Victor repeated, flat. 8 years old, my eyes, my mother's eyes, actually. Damien's voice was shaking now, and he let it, didn't fight it, because the shaking felt more honest than 10 years of careful control ever had. "You told me she left because she couldn't live with what I was becoming. You told me that the night after my father's funeral, standing in that exact hospital corridor, and I believed you because you were the only person in my life who hadn't lied to me yet. Damien, did you make her leave?" The question landed in the warehouse like a dropped weapon, and every man in the room felt the weight of it, felt the air change, felt the particular electricity that comes right before violence. Victor's jaw worked once, twice. When he spoke, his voice had lost its warehouse warmth, gone clipped and careful. "I protected this family." That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get tonight, in front of 15 men, about a conversation that happened a decade ago. Victor's eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the capos, a silent reminder that they were not alone, that some things were not meant for an audience. "We have a federal problem sitting on this table. We have a missing coordinator who might be wearing a wire as we speak. And you want to relitigate ancient history in front of the whole organization?" Answer the question, Victor. "I am not going to be interrogated by a boy I raised." The word landed wrong, too personal, too revealing, and Damien watched it land on Victor's own face a half second after it left his mouth. Watched the old man realize he'd said too much, shown too much, let something slip that 30 years of careful patience should have kept buried. "You didn't raise me." Damien's voice had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that the older capos in the room recognized from his father, the kind of quiet that preceded the worst violence any of them had ever witnessed. "My father raised me. You advised him. There's a difference, Victor, and I think tonight I'm finally seeing it. Your father is dead because he trusted the wrong people." Victor's composure cracked at the edges, voice rising. "I have spent 10 years keeping this family alive, keeping you alive, while you played at being a king without understanding what kingship actually costs. Don't you dare stand in this warehouse and question my loyalty. I'm not questioning your loyalty. Damien stepped closer, close enough now that he could see the old man's pulse jumping visibly in his throat, close enough that Marcus and Tony shifted uneasily near the door, hands drifting toward jackets they'd never normally need to reach for in this room. I'm questioning 10 years of decisions you made for me while I was too grief-sick to make them myself. I'm questioning why the woman I loved disappeared the same month you became the only voice I trusted. I'm questioning why my daughter grew up in poverty 3 miles from a house I could have given her, while you stood next to me at every family dinner, every christening, every funeral, smiling like a man with nothing to hide. Careful. Victor's voice dropped to something dangerous now, the warmth completely gone, replaced by something flat and reptilian that Damien had genuinely never seen on the old man's face in 20 years of knowing him. You're standing in a room full of men who answer to me as much as they answer to you. Watch your tone. The threat hung in the air, plain as a knife on the table, and for one long, terrible second, nobody moved. Nico's hand had drifted to his hip. Sal Bianchi had backed almost imperceptibly toward the wall. Marcus's eyes were locked on Victor's 2 personal guards near the door, both of them suddenly very still in the particular way of men preparing to act. Damien felt something in his chest go cold and clear, the way it always did right before he did something irreversible. 10 years of trusting this man, 10 years of treating Victor's word as gospel, of letting Victor's counsel shape every decision that mattered. While somewhere across the city, Elena scrubbed coffee stains off a countertop and raised his daughter on tips and exhaustion. You just threatened me, Damien said, almost wonderingly, like he was hearing the words for the first time even as they left his own mouth. In front of 15 men. You just threatened the boss of this family. I gave you a warning. There's a difference. But Victor's voice had lost its certainty, and Damien watched him recognize the mistake in real time, watched 30 years of careful patience crack down the middle in the warehouse light. Get out, Damien said. Excuse me? All of you. Damien's eyes swept the room, the capos, the soldiers, everyone except Marcus and Tony. Everyone out except Victor, now. Nobody moved for a second. The room caught in that terrible suspended moment where loyalty hadn't decided which direction to break. Then Sal Bianchi, perhaps grateful for any excuse to leave a room that suddenly felt like a held breath, moved first, and the rest followed in a slow, uneasy current toward the door, boots scuffing concrete, nobody speaking, everybody feeling the temperature of the room and understanding, on some animal level, that whatever happened next would decide which way the entire family bent. Within 90 seconds, it was just the 4 of them, Damien, Victor, Marcus, and Tony, standing in a warehouse that smelled like oil and rain and old secrets. You're making a mistake, Victor said quietly once the door had closed. I've made a lot of mistakes. 10 years of them, apparently. Damien planted both hands on the folding table, leaned forward until his face was a foot from Victor's. Tell me the truth. Right now. Did you make Elena leave? Victor's eyes flicked toward Marcus and Tony, calculating, and Damien could see him deciding something, weighing options, the same way Damien had watched him weigh options for 2 decades across negotiating tables and family disputes and quiet conversations about which men lived and which men disappeared. Whatever decision Victor reached, his face went smooth again, mask sliding back into place. I told Elena that staying with you would get her killed, Victor said finally, voice low. That was the truth then, and it's the truth now. The Calloway family had a contract out on anyone close to you during the transition. I moved her for her safety, for the safety of the child, once I learned about the child. You knew about Lily? Something flickered behind Victor's eyes, quick and gone. I knew. The cold thing in Damien's chest turned into something hotter, something that made his hands curl into fists against the table's metal edge. You knew I had a daughter for 8 years. You stood beside me at Easter dinners and family gatherings and let me grieve a relationship I thought had simply ended while you knew there was a child. I protected her by keeping her hidden. You protected your control over me. The words came out of Damien like something physical tearing loose. That's what this was. That's what this has always been. You needed me grieving and obedient and dependent on your counsel, and a wife and daughter would have given me something to live for beyond the family business, beyond you. That's not... Don't. Damien's voice cracked through the warehouse like a gunshot. Don't you dare lie to me again. Not tonight. Not after everything I just learned in that diner. Victor's jaw tightened, and for the first time Damien saw real anger surface beneath the careful mask, decades of resentment finally finding daylight. You want the truth? Fine. You were never ready to run this family. Your father knew it. I knew it. You were soft, Damien. Soft the way your mother was soft. And the only reason this organization survived your first 5 years as boss was because I was standing behind you, making the decisions you were too sentimental to make yourself. Elena would have made you softer. A child would have made you weak. I did what your father would have wanted. I made you strong. The silence after that confession felt like the inside of a held breath, like the moment between lightning and thunder when you know the violence is already happening, already traveling toward you, and there's nothing left to do but wait for the sound to arrive. You don't get to decide what my father wanted, Damien said very quietly. You don't get to decide what kind of man I become. You took that choice away from me 10 years ago, and you're still trying to take it now. Someone has to make the hard choices. Victor straightened, some of his old composure returning, gambling everything on conviction instead of apology. You think the men out there respect weakness? You think this family survives if its boss spends his nights playing house with a waitress and a child instead of running an empire? I gave you focus. I gave you purpose. And this is my thanks. Where is she? Damien cut in. Right now. Where's Elena, and is she safe? Something shifted in Victor's face, the first genuine hesitation Damien had seen all night, a half-second flicker that told him more than any words could have. I don't control her location anymore. She's been off the grid for years, working under... Don't lie to me, Victor. Damien's hand shot out and grabbed the front of the old man's jacket, hauling him forward across the table, close enough to feel his breath. Marcus took a step forward, and Damien threw up a hand without looking, a silent command that froze him in place. I asked you a simple question. Is she safe right now? Victor's eyes, for the first time in this entire conversation, showed something that looked almost like fear. There are people, he said carefully, who would very much like to know that you found her tonight. People I have spent 10 years keeping in the dark about Elena Cross and her daughter, because their continued ignorance was the only thing keeping that woman and that child alive. What people? The same people who put a contract out on her in the first place. Victor's voice dropped almost to a whisper, and despite everything, despite the anger boiling in Damien's chest, some old instinct told him that whatever came next was true, was the realest thing Victor Salazar had said all night. The Callaway contract was real, Damien. I didn't lie about that, but it was never canceled. It just went dormant, because as long as Elena stayed hidden, there was no reason to execute it. Tonight, in that diner, with your men standing right outside the window, you may have just told the entire city exactly where to find her. The warehouse seemed to tilt under Damien's feet. You're lying, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. I wish I were. Victor straightened his jacket where Damien's fist had crumpled it, and something in the gesture says calm, deliberate, almost performative, made the hair rise on the back of Damien's neck. You wanted the truth tonight. There it is. You walked into that diner like a man with nothing to lose, and in doing so, you may have just signed both their death warrants. Damien's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket, sudden and violent in the heavy silence of the warehouse. He pulled it out with hands that had gone strangely numb, and the screen lit up with a number he didn't recognize. A text message stripped of any context, 6 words that hit him harder than anything Victor had said all night. They have her. Come alone, or she dies. The phone screen burned into Damien's retinas, 6 words rewriting the entire shape of his night, and for one suspended second he forgot how to breathe, forgot Victor was even standing across the table, forgot everything except the image of Lily's face tilted up at him an hour ago, asking if he was her father. Who sent that? Victor's voice, low, careful, the question of a man who already suspected the answer and didn't like it. Damien turned the phone around without a word, watched Victor's eyes scan the message, watched the old man's face do something complicated. Surprise, maybe. Or a very good imitation of it. That's not a Callaway number. Victor pulled out his own phone, fingers moving fast. Callaway crew always works through burners registered out of Jersey. This route's through... He stopped. Through what? Give me a second. We don't have a second, Victor. Damien was already moving, already shoving the phone into his pocket and crossing the warehouse floor toward the door. Marcus and Tony falling into step behind him like they'd rehearsed this exact moment 100 times, even though none of them had. She's at the diner. Lily's with her. I left them there. Damien, wait. You said I told the whole city where to find her. Damien shoved through the warehouse door into the rain, the storm hitting him full in the face, cold enough to feel like punishment. So we go now, right now. That's exactly what they want. Victor's voice followed him out, sharp with something that might have been genuine alarm. Think. A text telling you to come alone. That's not a rescue. That's a trap. You walk into that diner alone and you're not saving her. You're handing them the only thing they actually want, which is you. Damien spun around, rain running down his face, and for one terrible second he hated Victor with a clarity that scared him. You don't get to give me advice tonight, not after what you just told me in there. I'm not asking you to trust me. Victor stood in the warehouse doorway, the yellow light behind him throwing his shadow long across the wet asphalt. I'm asking you to think like the man your father trained, not the man currently losing his mind over a woman he hasn't spoken to in a decade. That woman is the mother of my daughter. And dead men don't get to be fathers. Victor's voice cracked like a whip. Walk into that trap exactly the way they want you to, and you orphan her twice in one night. The words landed because they were true, and Damien hated that they were true. Hated standing in the rain with his chest heaving and his hands shaking, caught between every instinct screaming at him to run, and the cold mechanical part of his brain, the part his father built, the part Victor sharpened, telling him that running blind was exactly how men in this life ended up dead. Marcus? Damien's voice came out rougher than he wanted. Get eyes on the diner, now! Don't approach. Don't make contact. Just tell me what you see. Marcus already had his phone out, already dialing a number, already moving toward the car with Tony close behind. Damien watched them go and turned back to Victor, rain plastering his hair flat against his skull, and for one moment the two of them just stood there, 10 feet apart, 20 years of trust collapsing into something neither of them had words for yet. If anything happens to her, Damien said, I will burn every part of this family down looking for whoever sent that message. And if I find out you had anything to do with it, I didn't. Victor's jaw was tight. Whatever else I've done, whatever else I've lied about, I didn't send that text, and I didn't put a target on that child's back tonight. You did that the second you walked into that diner without thinking. It was the cruelest thing Victor had said all night, and it landed exactly where he meant it to. Damien's phone rang before he could answer. Marcus. Boss? Marcus's voice had the flat, controlled quality of a man trying very hard not to panic. Diner's dark. Closed signs up, but it's not closed up closed. It's... Boss, there's a broken coffee pot on the floor by the door. Door's unlocked. No sign of forced entry on the front, but the back exit by the kitchen. The lock's been drilled out. Cameras? Place doesn't have any. It's a 2-bit diner, boss. There's nothing. Damien closed his eyes, rain running down his face, and made himself breathe, made himself find the cold center his father taught him to find before every impossible decision. Anyone inside? No, place is empty. No bodies, no blood that I can see. Just the coffee pot and an open back door. No blood. Damien held on to that fact like a man holding onto a ledge, because the alternative, the version of tonight where he found Elena and Lily bleeding out on cracked linoleum, was a version of reality he didn't have the architecture to survive. Stay there. Don't touch anything. I'm coming. Boss, if this is a trap... I know it's a trap. Damien was already moving toward Victor's car, the only vehicle close enough, fishing in his pocket for the keys he didn't have. Victor, keys. You're not driving anywhere until you have a plan. I have a plan. The plan is I get my daughter back. That's not a plan. That's a death wish dressed up in a father's clothing. Victor stepped between Damien and the car, and for a second Damien seriously considered putting him through the warehouse wall. Listen to me. If this is Callaway's people, they don't want you dead immediately. They want leverage. A man like Salvatore Calloway has wanted your territory for 15 years, and he's smart enough to know that killing you outright just starts a war he can't win cleanly. He wants you compliant. He wants you broken. Which means right now, in whatever room they're keeping them, Elena and that little girl are worth more to him alive than dead. You don't know that. I know Salvatore Calloway better than I know my own children, Victor said, and something in his voice cracked slightly on the word children, something Damien filed away without having the bandwidth to examine it. Let me make some calls. Let me find out where they're holding her before you go charging in blind and get all three of you killed. Every cell in Damien's body screamed against waiting, against patience, against anything that wasn't immediate violent motion toward the people who'd taken his daughter on the same night he'd learned she existed. But 20 years of training underneath this exact man had built reflexes that didn't disappear just because trust had shattered, and some grim surviving part of him recognized that Victor was right, that running blind into a trap built specifically to bait him would end with everyone he loved dead instead of just terrified. You have 30 minutes, Damien said. 30 minutes, Victor. Then I stop waiting for your calls and I start tearing this city apart myself. Victor nodded once, already dialing, already walking back toward the warehouse with the phone pressed to his ear, voice dropping into the low, business-like cadence of a man calling in decades of favors. Damien stood alone in the rain and watched him go, and something about the old man's back, straight, unbothered, moving with the easy confidence of someone who already knew how this would end, needled at something in the base of Damien's skull that he didn't have time to examine. The drive to the diner took 11 minutes that felt like 11 years. Marcus and Tony were waiting outside when he arrived, both of them soaked through, Tony pacing a tight circle on the cracked pavement with his hand resting on the gun under his jacket. The inside of the diner looked exactly like Marcus described. The broken coffee pot in a dark stain on the floor, the overturned napkin dispenser, a single waitress shoe lying on its side near the counter like something dropped mid-run. Damien crouched and picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and felt something break loose in his chest that he didn't have a name for. "Boss?" Tony's voice, careful. "There's something on the counter." A folded piece of paper sat exactly where the coffee pot had been, weighted down by a chipped diner mug. Damien's hands weren't steady when he unfolded it, and the words inside hit him like a physical blow. "You should have stayed away 10 years ago. Your father's mistakes are about to become yours. Be at the old Castellano fish market on Pier 19 by 2 a.m. Alone. If we see Marcus Webb or Anthony Russo or any other Moretti soldier within 4 blocks, the woman dies first, slowly, while the girl watches. You have 90 minutes. Damien read it twice, and on the second read, something cold and surgical replaced the panic in his chest. The note didn't read like Calloway. Calloway crews were loud, theatrical, the kind of men who left bodies as messages. This was different, precise, controlled, written by someone who knew exactly how to hurt him without spilling a drop of unnecessary blood. Someone who knew Marcus and Tony by their full names. Someone who knew about his father. "This isn't Calloway," Damien said quietly. "How do you know?" Tony asked. "Because Calloway's men don't know Marcus's last name is Webb." Damien looked up, something sharpening behind his eyes. "Nobody outside this family knows that. Marcus has worked under 3 different aliases for the Calloway crew specifically because his real name was supposed to be buried." The silence that followed had a different texture than the silence before it. Heavier, colder. The particular silence of men realizing the threat wasn't external at all. Damien's phone buzzed again. Not a text this time. A call from Victor. "Talk to me," Damien said, voice tight. "I made the calls." Victor's voice came through ragged, like he'd been running or arguing or both. "Damien, listen to me very carefully, because I need you to hear this before you do anything else tonight." "Where is she?" "Calloway's people haven't moved on anyone tonight. I confirmed it 3 different ways. Whoever has Elena and your daughter, it isn't them." The fish market note burned in Damien's free hand. "I know. I have a note here that says otherwise. Someone wants me at Pier 19 by 2 a.m., and they know things about my crew that outsiders shouldn't know." A long pause on the line, long enough that Damien could hear Victor breathing, ragged and uneven, in a way the old man's voice never was, not in 20 years of negotiations and funerals and family wars. Pier 19, Victor said finally, very quietly. You know it. It's not Callaway territory. It hasn't been Callaway territory in 6 years. Victor's voice had gone strange, hollowed out, like he was speaking from somewhere very far away. Pier 19 is ours, Damien. It's been ours since the Castellano family folded into us. The only people with keys to that fish market are people inside this organization. The floor of Damien's understanding cracked clean down the middle. Say that again. Whoever took them, Victor said, is one of ours. Damien's mind raced backward through the night, through the warehouse, through the capos standing in that loose, uneasy circle, through Nico leaning against the support beam with careful blankness on his face, through Sal Bianchi grateful to be alive and desperate to prove his loyalty after the humiliation of being caught skimming, through every man who'd stood close enough tonight to overhear that Elena Cross was alive, that Lily existed, that the boss of the Moretti family had a weakness nobody had known about an hour ago. Victor, Damien's voice had dropped to something almost inhumanly calm, the calm that lived on the other side of panic, the calm his father used to talk about right before the worst nights of the war with the Callaways. Who was in that warehouse who could have heard me say her name? Everyone, Damien, every single man in that room heard you say her name. Then narrow it for me. Who in that room has the keys to Pier 19, knows Marcus's real name, and had a reason to want me weak enough to make a stupid mistake tonight? The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Damien thought the call had dropped, until finally Victor spoke again, and his voice had lost every trace of the warehouse's careful authority, gone instead small and strange, and frightened in a way Damien had genuinely never heard from him before. There's something I need to tell you, Victor said. Something I should have told you 10 years ago, the same night I told you Elena left because she couldn't stand what you were becoming. Tell me now. The Callaway contract on Elena was real. I told you the truth about that. Victor's breathing had gone uneven, the sound of a man finally cracking under the weight of something carried far too long. But I never told you who actually negotiated it into existence. I never told you because the man who arranged it sat at every family dinner with us for the last decade, smiling at you, calling you nephew, while quietly building his own network inside the organization piece by piece, year by year, waiting for exactly the kind of moment that just walked into a diner 3 miles from your house. The words hit Damien like a freight train, and somewhere behind them, underneath the roar of his own pulse in his ears, he heard the name before Victor even said it, felt it arrive in his chest like something he'd known all along and refused to look at directly. Nico, Damien said. The silence that answered him was confirmation enough. The name sat in Damien's chest like a bullet that hadn't finished tearing through muscle, still moving, still doing damage on its way to wherever it would finally stop. His cousin. The kid he'd taught to throw a punch behind their grandfather's garage when they were both 12 years old. The kid who'd stood beside him at his father's funeral with his hand on Damien's shoulder, steady, present, the only family member who hadn't looked at Damien like a problem to be managed. Say it again, Damien said into the phone, voice flat and strange even to his own ears. Nico set up the Callaway contract 8 years ago, Victor said, words tumbling faster now, like a dam finally giving way after decades of pressure. I found out by accident. A payment routed through an account I was monitoring for unrelated reasons. I should have told you. I told myself I was protecting the family by handling it quietly, by watching him, by waiting until I had enough to move without starting a war inside our own walls. I have spent 8 years watching your cousin build a second organization underneath the one your father built, and I told myself every single day that I was one piece of evidence away from bringing it to you. I was a coward, Damien. I was a coward, and now your daughter is paying for it. Damien didn't answer. He was already moving, already shoving the note into his jacket, already barking orders at Marcus and Tony with a voice that had gone hard and clean, stripped of everything except function. Pier 19. Now. Boss, the note said alone. The note was written by a man who's been planning this for 8 years and just made his first mistake, Damien said, yanking open the car door. He thinks I don't know it's him. That buys us something. Get in. The drive to the waterfront took 14 minutes through streets slick with rain, streetlights smearing gold across the windshield. Damien's hands tight on the wheel, because if he let himself think too hard about Lily's face, about the 8-year-old weight of a man's betrayal finally landing, his hands would start shaking and never stop. Marcus rode shotgun, checking the magazine of his sidearm with the calm, repetitive motion of a man who'd done it 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. Tony sat in the back, silent, jaw tight, staring out at the rain-streaked dark like he was already rehearsing the violence to come. "Talk to me about the fish market," Damien said. "Layout, exits, anything." "2 main buildings," Tony said. "Old processing floor, cold storage in the back, loading dock facing the water. 1 road in, the rest is pier and open water. If Nico's smart, he's got men posted on the rooftop of the processing floor. Sightline covers the whole approach." "He's smart." Damien's knuckles went white on the wheel. "He's been smart for 8 years and I never saw it." "Boss," Marcus's voice careful, "we go in loud. There's a real chance he kills them before we get close enough to stop it. We go in alone like the note says. There's a real chance you don't walk back out." "I know. So what's the play?" Damien didn't answer right away. He was thinking about his father, about the year before the assassination, about a lesson the old man had drilled into him so many times it had become reflex. A man who spent years building a trap wants you to walk into the trap exactly the way he imagined it. Break the shape of his imagination, and you break the trap. "The play," Damien said finally, "is I go in alone, like he wants. You two find a way onto that pier without being seen, and you wait for my signal." "What signal?" "You'll know it when you hear it." They parked 4 blocks out, in the shadow of a shuttered ironworks building, rain hammering the car roof loud enough to swallow conversation. Damien climbed out into the storm and felt something settle into him that he hadn't felt in 10 years. Not the cold mechanical calm of running an empire, but something older, raw, the feeling of a man with exactly one thing left to lose and nothing left to calculate. He walked the 4 blocks alone. The fish market rose up out of the dark like something half-drowned, corrugated metal walls streaked with rust, the smell of brine and old fish guts thick enough to taste even through the rain. A single light burned in the loading dock window, yellow and dim, and Damien's whole body went taut at the sight of it, every nerve screaming at him to run faster, even as his training forced his pace into something slow, deliberate, unthreatening. The loading dock door was open, waiting. He stepped inside and the smell hit him first, fish and salt and motor oil, and then his eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw her. Elena sat in a metal folding chair in the center of the processing floor, wrists zip-tied behind her, a cut above her eyebrow leaking a thin line of blood down her temple, her uniform torn at the shoulder. She looked up when the door opened and her whole face broke. Relief and terror tangled together so completely that Damien couldn't tell which one was winning. "Damien, don't!" Her voice cracked, cut off as a hand clamped over her mouth from behind. "Where's Lily?" Damien's voice didn't sound like his own. Nico stepped out from behind a stack of rusted processing tables, and the sight of him, his cousin, his blood, dressed in a dark coat with rain still beating on the shoulders, a gun held loose and casual in one hand like he was holding nothing more dangerous than a cup of coffee, made something in Damien's chest crack clean down the center. "She's safe," Nico said. "For now. That depends entirely on you." "Nico." Damien's hands were shaking and he let them, didn't try to hide it, because some part of him understood that whatever happened in the next 10 minutes, pretending to be unaffected wasn't going to save anyone. 8 years. You always were slow to see things in front of your own face. Nico's voice carried none of the warmth Damien remembered from 20 years of shared holidays, shared grief, shared blood. It was flat, almost bored, the voice of a man who'd rehearsed this confrontation so many times in his head that the real version felt almost anticlimactic. "Victor told you, I assume." Coward finally found his spine after 8 years of watching from the sidelines. "Why?" It came out raw, more wound than question. "We grew up together. You stood next to me when they buried my father. And while I was standing there smiling, holding your shoulder, you know what I was thinking?" Nico's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. I was thinking about how your father chose you over me. Same blood, Damien. Same grandfather. The only difference is whose son got born first, and that accident of timing handed you an empire while I got to spend my whole life standing one step behind you, watching you make mistake after mistake and clean up exactly nothing, because cleaning up your messes was never going to make this family mine. So you sold out your own blood to the Callaways. I built something. Nico's voice rose for the first time, real anger surfacing underneath the careful performance. 8 years, piece by piece, soldier by soldier, while you were busy drowning in grief over a woman who left because she was smart enough to see what staying would cost her. I built a network inside this family that answers to me and only me. The Callaway contract wasn't betrayal, Damien. It was leverage. Elena disappearing wasn't supposed to break you. It was supposed to make you weak enough, distracted enough, that eventually I could step in and take what should have been mine from the start. And tonight? Tonight you walked into a diner and undid 8 years of careful work in about 4 minutes. Nico's grip tightened on the gun. You found out about the kid. You started asking questions. Victor started panicking and making calls. I had exactly one move left, which was to accelerate the timeline before this whole operation collapsed around me. So you took my daughter. I took leverage. Nico's eyes flicked toward the back of the room, toward a closed cold storage door, and Damien's whole body went rigid, every muscle screaming toward that door, before his mind even finished processing what it meant. She's fine. Scared, probably. Locked in cold storage isn't exactly comfortable, but she's breathing, which is more than I can say for what happens next if you don't make the right choice in the next 60 seconds. What choice? You sign over operational control of the family, tonight, in writing, witnessed, irrevocable. You walk away with your woman and your kid and whatever scraps of dignity you've got left, and I take the empire your father should have left to me in the first place. Nico's voice had gone almost gentle, almost reasonable, the voice of a man who genuinely believed he was offering mercy. Or you refuse, and I put a bullet in Elena's skull right here in front of you, and then I go open that cold storage door and explain to an 8-year-old girl why her father chose pride over her life. The threat landed in the room like something physical, and Damien felt the entire architecture of his life narrow down to this single impossible moment. 10 years of grief, an empire built on his father's blood, the woman he'd never stopped loving even while hating her for a lie that was never hers, a daughter he'd known for less than 2 hours and already loved with a ferocity that scared him. You don't get to win this by threatening a child, Damien said, voice low, shaking with something that had stopped being fear and turned into pure, focused rage. I don't need to win pretty. I just need to win. Elena made a muffled sound against the hand over her mouth, eyes wide, desperate, trying to communicate something Damien couldn't read fast enough. He took a step forward, and the gun in Nico's hand snapped up instantly, leveled at Elena's temple, and Damien froze with his heart slamming against his ribs hard enough to hurt. Ah. Nico's finger curled tighter against the trigger. One more step and this conversation ends very differently than either of us wants. Damien's mind raced, calculating distances, angles, the 4 blocks Marcus and Tony needed to cover in the dark and rain. The signal he hadn't actually given yet because the moment had collapsed faster than he'd planned for. His eyes flicked once toward the loading dock door behind him, toward the rusted catwalk running along the ceiling of the processing floor, toward the cold storage door in the back where his daughter sat alone in the dark. And something in his chest hardened into a decision he didn't fully understand until he was already moving. Fine, Damien said, raising both hands slowly, palms open, the posture of total surrender. You want the empire? Take it. I don't care anymore, Nico. You hear me. I don't care about any of it. Just let them go first. Nico's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. You're agreeing too fast. I'm agreeing because I'm done. Damien's voice cracked, and he let it crack, let 10 years of exhaustion bleed into every syllable because the rawness was real, even if the surrender wasn't. I found out 2 hours ago I have a daughter. 2 hours, Nico. You want to know what that does to a man? It burns away everything else. The empire, the territory, The war with the Callaways, none of it means anything anymore. Take it all. I just want them alive. For a moment, just a moment, something shifted behind Nico's eyes. The old cousin, the kid from behind the garage, some flicker of the relationship that 8 years of secret betrayal hadn't fully managed to kill. And in that half-second of hesitation, in the gap between Nico's anger and Nico's doubt, Damien heard it. A sound from the rooftop, faint, controlled. 3 measured taps against corrugated metal, exactly the signal he and Tony had used since they were teenagers running messages for the old man. A signal so old and buried that Nico, for all 8 years of careful planning, had no reason left to remember it. Marcus and Tony were in position. Nico's eyes flicked toward the ceiling, toward the sound, suspicion crashing back over his face like a wave. What was that? Rain on the roof, Damien said, and started walking forward, slow, deliberate. Hands still raised, eyes locked on his cousin's face, counting silently in his head. 3, 2, stop right there. Nico's gun swung between Damien and Elena, panic finally cracking through 8 years of careful composure. I said stop! The lights went out. All of them, all at once. The single yellow bulb in the loading dock and whatever backup lighting Nico's men had rigged through the processing floor, plunging the entire warehouse into a darkness so complete that for one disorienting half-second, Damien lost all sense of distance, of direction, of anything except the violent thunder of his own pulse in his ears. Somewhere in the black, Elena screamed. Darkness swallowed the warehouse whole, and Damien moved through it the way his father had taught him to move through anything. Not by sight, but by memory, by the count he'd kept in his head since his first step through the loading dock door. 3 steps to the processing table. 5 more to where Elena's chair had been bolted to the floor before tonight. He dropped low, below where a panicked man's first shot would go, and heard Nico's gun discharge twice into the black, the muzzle flash strobing the room in violent yellow snapshots. Elena thrashing against the zip ties, the masked man behind her stumbling back from her elbow, driven hard into his ribs. Nico's face twisted into something that wasn't rage anymore, just fear dressed up as rage because the only thing more dangerous than a cornered man was a cornered man who already knew he'd lost. Damien hit him low, shoulder driving into Nico's midsection with everything 10 years of buried grief had built up in his body, and they went down together onto the wet concrete, the gun skittering off into the dark with a sound like a coin dropped down a well. Nico's fist caught him across the jaw, white light exploding behind his eyes, and Damien tasted blood, copper and warm, and didn't stop, couldn't stop, drove his own fist into his cousin's ribs once, twice, the impact traveling up his arm and into his shoulder until his whole body screamed with it. You don't get her! Damien's voice came out broken, barely human, each word punctuated by another blow. You don't get to touch either of them. Somewhere above, the rooftop access door blew open, and Marcus and Tony came down a steel ladder fast and loud, flashlight beams cutting wild arcs through the dark, catching Nico's masked man mid-lunge toward Elena's chair, and dropping him with 2 shots that echoed off the corrugated walls like cannon fire. Elena screamed again, a different scream this time, not terror, but something closer to fury, throwing her whole weight sideways out of the chair, zip-tied wrists and all, putting distance between herself and the chaos. Nico bucked underneath Damien, got a knee up into his stomach hard enough to drive the air from his lungs, and for one terrible second Damien's grip slipped, and his cousin was scrambling free across the wet concrete, reaching, fingers closing around the fallen gun. Damien didn't think. He moved. His hand closed around Nico's wrist a half-second before the gun came level, and the two of them grappled in the dark, breath-ragged, blood and rain mixing on the floor beneath them. The gun wavering between Damien's chest and the ceiling and back again, Nico's teeth bared, eyes wide and wild with 8 years of buried resentment finally boiling over into something with no plan left, no leverage left, nothing but animal desperation. You were always supposed to lose, Nico hissed, spit flecked with blood. I built something real, and you built a cage. Damien wrenched the wrist sideways with everything he had left, heard something pop, heard Nico howl, watched the gun finally clatter free across the concrete. And you locked yourself inside it. The fight went out of Nico all at once, the way it sometimes did with men who'd spent everything they had on one desperate gamble and lost. He sagged back against the cold storage door, cradling his ruined wrist, chest heaving, and Damien knelt over him in the dark, with blood running from his split lip, hands shaking, every part of him screaming to finish it, and some smaller, harder-won part refusing to let him. "Lily," Elena's voice cut through the dark, raw with panic, zip-tied hands held awkwardly in front of her as she stumbled toward the cold storage door. "She's in there, Damien! She's been in there for an hour!" Tony reached the door first, flashlight beam catching the heavy steel latch, and Damien left Nico slumped against the wall. Not free, not forgiven, just temporarily forgotten, and threw his weight against the door beside him. It groaned open into freezing dark, and there, curled against a stack of empty crates with her knees pulled to her chest and her dinosaur keychain clutched in one small fist like a talisman, was Lily. She flinched at the light, eyes wide and glassy with hours of crying, and for one terrible second Damien thought something in her had broken permanently, something that wouldn't come back even after tonight ended. Then she saw Elena pushing past him into the cold storage room, zip ties still cutting red lines into her wrists, and the girl's whole body convulsed with a sob so violent it bent her in half. "Mom, I'm here, baby. I'm here. I've got you." Elena dropped to her knees, awkward with her bound hands, and gathered Lily against her chest, and Damien stood in the doorway with blood on his face and his cousin's gun somewhere behind him in the dark, watching the two people he'd known for less than 3 hours and somehow already loved more than he'd loved anything in 10 years, and felt something inside his chest break open that had been sealed shut since the night his father died. "Cut her loose," he said to Tony, voice raw, and Tony's knife made quick work of the zip ties while Damien crossed the small room and crouched down in front of them both. Not reaching, not crowding, just present, just there. Lily looked up at him over her mother's shoulder, face blotchy, eyes red-rimmed, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all. "You came," she said finally, small and disbelieving. "I told you I would." Damien's voice cracked on every word. "I meant it." She unfolded slowly from Elena's arms, hesitant, watching his face like she was still doing the math from the diner, still measuring him against the worn photograph in her backpack, and then she closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around his neck with a desperation that nearly knocked him backward onto the concrete. Damien held her like something that might shatter if he gripped too hard, or vanish if he didn't grip hard enough. And over her shoulder he found Elena's eyes in the dim light, and the two of them looked at each other across 10 years of buried grief and lies that weren't entirely either of their fault. And something passed between them that didn't need words yet, might not need words for a long time, but was no longer the cold, dead silence of the diner 3 hours earlier. Behind them, slumped against the cold storage door with his wrist swelling and his face streaked with blood and rain, Nico watched the three of them with an expression Damien couldn't read and didn't have room left to care about. "Police are 4 minutes out," Marcus said, jogging back into the room, flashlight sweeping the dark. "Feds too, apparently. Looks like whoever's been watching Dominic Reyes finally caught wind of activity down here." The mention of federal involvement should have terrified Damien a week ago. Tonight it landed differently, almost like relief, like the universe finally agreeing to take some of the weight off his shoulders. What followed in the hours after blurred together the way the worst and best nights of a man's life tend to blur. Flashing lights bouncing off rain-slicked warehouse walls, federal agents and windbreakers moving through the fish market with the methodical calm of people who'd been waiting years for exactly this opening. Nico led out in handcuffs with his ruined wrist wrapped in a makeshift sling, refusing to look at anyone, jaw set in the same stubborn line Damien remembered from childhood arguments over nothing that mattered. Victor arrived sometime around 4 in the morning, soaked through, older somehow, standing at the edge of the police tape and watching the wreckage of an empire he'd spent 20 years protecting collapse in real time. "They're going to want to talk to you," Victor said quietly, when Damien finally crossed to where he stood. "The feds. About Reyes. About the Callaway contract. About everything Nico built underneath us. This is the kind of investigation that doesn't stop until it finds the bottom. Let them look." Damien's voice had gone flat with exhaustion, but underneath the exhaustion was something steadier than he'd felt in years. I'm done protecting an empire that cost me a decade with my own daughter. Victor studied him for a long moment, rain dripping off the brim of his coat, and something in the old man's face folded inward, decades of careful control finally giving way to something that looked almost like grief. I told myself for 8 years that staying quiet about Nico was protecting the family. I told myself the same thing about Elena, all those years ago. I was wrong both times, and I don't know how a man spends that many years being wrong about the people he claims to love. You're not the only one who has that question to sit with. No. Victor's eyes drifted toward Elena and Lily, sitting wrapped in a blanket on the back of an ambulance. A paramedic crouched in front of them, checking Lily's pulse with gentle, practiced hands. But I think you've got considerably more reason to find an answer than I do. Damien didn't argue. He walked away from Victor without a goodbye because some bridges, once burned, weren't meant to be rebuilt, only acknowledged and left behind, and crossed the wet pavement to where his daughter sat shivering under a wool blanket with her mother's arm around her shoulders. The months that followed moved slower than the night that started them, the way recovery always does after violence. Federal investigators dismantling what remained of Nico's network piece by piece, the Callaway contract finally voided in a tense, closely brokered meeting that Damien walked into, not as a boss seeking territory, but as a man negotiating for the simple right to be left alone. He stepped back from operational control of the family within the month, signed papers that would have been unthinkable to him a year earlier, watched what remained of his father's empire get absorbed and dissolved and federally monitored into something that no longer had room for men like Damien Moretti at its center. He didn't mourn it the way he expected to. Some nights, lying awake in a small rented house 3 streets from Elena's diner, he found he didn't mourn it at all. Elena kept the diner. Damien helped her repaint the sign one Saturday in early spring, the two of them up on ladders with brushes and rollers, Lily sitting cross-legged on the curb supervising with the absolute authority only an 8-year-old could summon. And when they finally stepped back to look at the finished sign, Ellie's Diner, the apostrophe restored, the letters bright and steady against fresh paint. Elena had laughed for the first time since the night at the fish market. A real laugh, rough at the edges, but genuine, and something in Damien's chest had unknotted that had been wound tight since he was 18 years old. They didn't rush anything. There were nights Elena still flinched at sudden movement near doors. Nights Lily woke from nightmares about cold storage rooms and had to be talked back to sleep with the lights left on. Nights Damien sat awake replaying the warehouse, the gun, the half-second where Nico's finger had curled against the trigger, and everything could have ended differently. Healing, he learned, wasn't a single dramatic turn, but 1,000 small ordinary ones. Learning to cook breakfast for a kid who liked her eggs a very specific way, learning to sit quietly with Elena on the back step of the diner without needing to fill the silence with apology, learning that trust, once broken as badly as theirs had been, could only be rebuilt in small, honest increments, never in grand gestures. On a warm evening in late spring, almost a year to the day since Damien had first walked into a diner to escape a sleepless night, the 3 of them closed up Ellie's together after the dinner rush, Lily stacking chairs onto tables with the careful seriousness of someone who'd been doing the job for years instead of months, Elena counting the register with a pencil tucked behind her ear, Damien sweeping the floor near the door where a coffee pot had once shattered on cracked linoleum. The bell over the door had long since stopped reminding him of that night, had become instead the ordinary sound of an ordinary evening, customers coming and going, a life rebuilding itself one unremarkable day at a time. "Dad?" Lily's voice still new enough on her tongue that it caught something in his chest every single time. "Can we get a dog?" "Ask your mother." "She said ask you." Elena laughed without looking up from the register. "I did not say that." "You basically said that." Damien set the broom against the counter and crossed to where Lily stood on her tiptoes trying to reach the last chair, lifted her easily, settled her against his hip the way he'd learned to do over months of small, ordinary moments that had slowly, quietly become the architecture of an entirely different life than the one he thought he'd inherited at 18. Outside the window, the evening light had gone gold and soft over the street, the kind of light that made even cracked pavement look forgiving. He thought about his father sometimes, about the empire the old man had built and the war it had cost, About all the things he'd believed for 10 years that turned out to be lies built on top of other lies. Victor's careful manipulations and Nico's quiet decade-long betrayal, and his own willingness to believe the worst about the only woman he'd ever loved, because believing it hurt less than asking questions. He thought about how close he'd come to losing everything that actually mattered while chasing everything that didn't. "You okay?" Elena asked, watching him from behind the register, the particular soft attention she'd started giving him over the months whenever his face went somewhere distant. "Yeah." Damien set Lily down, watched her run off toward the back to grab her backpack, dinosaur keychain swinging. "Yeah, I'm okay." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the words were simply true. No calculation behind them, no empire to protect, no decade of grief dressed up as control. Just a man standing in a small diner at closing time, rain long since cleared from a sky gone soft and gold, watching his daughter sling a backpack over her shoulder and his daughter's mother lock the register with steady, unhurried hands, understanding finally, completely, that the only kingdom he'd ever actually needed had been small enough to fit inside this room all along.